31. My Amish husband never let me close the curtains. The reason wasn't about modesty. My daughter asked me last spring why I never hang curtains. She was standing in the kitchen of the small house I rent now, the one with the yellow paint and the drafty back window, and she was looking at the bare glass the way a person looks at something that bothers them without knowing why. She is 26 years old. She grew up watching me leave every window in every room uncovered, and she had never once asked about it until that morning. I told her I liked the light. She nodded and poured her coffee and let it go, the way young people do when they sense a longer answer is available but aren't sure they want it yet. I watched her hands around the mug, and I thought about her father, and I thought about the farmhouse in Clear Creek Township where I spent 11 years learning that a bare window is never only a bare window. I was 53 years old that morning. The events I am about to describe began when I was 22. That is 31 years of carrying something I mostly kept folded up and stored in a place I didn't visit often. My daughter deserved the truth before I got any older. And so, a few days after that morning in the kitchen, I sat down and I began, for the first time, to arrange it in order. Her name, my daughter's name, is Clara, and this story belongs to her as much as it belongs to me. I grew up in a community in eastern Ohio, in a district that held tightly to the old ways without apology. My father was a deacon. My mother was a quiet woman who expressed love through proximity rather than words. She would simply come and stand near you when she sensed something was wrong, close enough that her shoulder touched yours, and that was how you knew she had noticed. We had 4 children in our house. I was the second daughter. I knew how to preserve and sew and manage a kitchen before I was 14, and I did not think of those things as limitations. They were the shape of the life I expected. I met Eli Schlabach when I was 19. He came from a family 2 districts over, which in our world felt like a considerable distance. His father was a well-regarded man, a furniture builder with a reputation that had traveled ahead of him, and Eli carried that reputation the way some men carry money, quietly, but aware of it at all times. He was 31 when we were introduced. He was not unkind in those early months. He was deliberate and steady in a way I confused for strength. And when my father told me that Eli had asked to court me formally, I felt something I understood then as certainty. We were married in October of my 22nd year. The service was at my parents' home, the way it was done. His family sat on one side, mine on the other, and outside the long windows, the fields had already gone gray and dry with the end of harvest. I remember my mother's shoulder pressing against mine just before I walked forward, that old wordless signal. I remember thinking she was happy for me. The farmhouse where Eli brought me sat on 43 acres outside the township. It was a good house by any measure we used, solid, well-maintained, with a deep porch and a kitchen that caught the morning sun. I had seen it twice before the wedding. I had noticed, both times, that the windows held no curtains. I assumed they had been removed before the sale, or that the previous tenants had taken them. I did not ask. On our second morning there, I began measuring the windows for fabric. I had brought 2 bolts of dark green cloth in my trousseau, the kind my mother used, and I spread them across the kitchen table to begin cutting. Eli came in from feeding the animals, and he stood in the doorway watching me for a moment. "Leave the windows," he said. "I'm just making curtains for the kitchen to start," I told him. "Leave them," he said again, and he walked through to wash his hands, and the conversation was finished. I thought it was a preference. A man's household had a man's preferences, and I had been raised to understand that the first months of a marriage were a time of learning which battles were real battles, and which were simply the unfamiliar territory of another person's habits. I folded the green cloth and put it away. I told myself it was a small thing. It did not feel small by winter. By December, I had begun to notice a pattern I could not yet name. In the evenings, when the dark came early, and the lamplight would have shown our shapes through any uncovered glass, Eli would move through the house checking windows. Not closing curtains, we had none, but checking, standing at each pane for a moment, looking out. If I moved to a window in the evening, he would find a reason to come into that room. I asked him once, directly, whether it was a matter of faith. In our district, there were families who kept their windows bare as a form of modesty, an acknowledgement that the home should not display itself to the world. I had heard this reasoning before, offered by elders who believed that even lamplight through glass was a kind of showing off. Eli looked at me steadily. "It is a matter of this house," he said. "Not every rule needs a sermon attached to it." I accepted that. I was still learning to read him, still in the early phase of a marriage where you tell yourself that understanding will come with time. And in most respects, our life was ordinary. He worked, I worked, we attended church. He was not violent. He did not raise his voice. There were evenings where he sat with me at the table and spoke about the farm with something close to warmth. But the windows never changed, and as spring came and the days lengthened, I began to realize that it wasn't the evening light he was managing. It was the view from the road. Clara called me on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after her kitchen visit. She said she had been thinking about what I hadn't said. She had a way of doing that, circling back to silences, the way you circle back to a word in a sentence that didn't sit right. I told her I had been thinking about it too. She asked if it was about her father. I said yes. There was a pause, the kind that has texture to it. She said, "Mom, I'm not 19 anymore. I know that. I have always known that knowing a thing is ready and deciding to hand it over are two separate acts." I told her I would tell her the whole of it, but that she needed to understand it began long before she was born, and that some of what I would tell her, I had not understood myself until years after it was already over. She said, "Start wherever you need to start." So I went back to the spring of my second year in that house. His name was Daniel Graber. I did not know that name in those early years. I only knew that occasionally, perhaps twice a month, a gray truck would slow on the road that ran past our property. It would not stop. It would roll past at walking speed, and then continue on toward the county road. I noticed it the way you notice something that repeats without explanation, with a low-grade unease you cannot fully justify. The first time I mentioned it to Eli, he was at the woodpile. He set down his axe and turned to look at the road, though the truck was long gone by then. His expression did not change. "Don't watch the road," he said. I wasn't watching. I happened to see it. Then happened to see something else. He picked up the axe and went back to his work, and I stood there with the feeling that I had stepped onto ice, without realizing the ground had changed beneath me. By that second summer, I had learned the shape of the restriction precisely. The windows could not be covered. I could not stand at them in the evenings. If the truck appeared, I was not to acknowledge it, not to move toward the glass, not to raise a hand, not to react in any way that could be seen from the road. Eli never explained these instructions as a connected system. They came separately, weeks apart, delivered in his even, quiet voice, as though each one were simply a matter of household management. I was young. I was isolated in the specific way that Amish women in closed districts can be isolated without anyone intending harm, surrounded by community on Sundays, alone on the farm the rest of the week. My nearest neighbor was a widow named Ruth Yoder, who lived a half-mile down the road, and who brought me a jar of pickled beets when I first arrived, and whom I was not discouraged from seeing, but not actively encouraged to see either. Ruth was the first person who said the name Daniel Graber to me. It was the autumn of my third year, during a canning afternoon at her kitchen table. We were working through a bushel of tomatoes, and she was telling me about families who had left the district over the years. The way older women in communities sometimes catalog departures the way others catalog weather, as a way of measuring time, of accounting for change. She mentioned a family named Graber. She did so carefully, I noticed later, the way you mention a thing you have been considering mentioning for some time. "The Graber boy," she said, not looking up from her work. "Daniel, he left before you came. His family still has land on the county line." I kept my hands moving. "I don't think I know them." Ruth set down a tomato and looked at me directly. She was 70 years old and had lived in that township her entire life, and there was a quality to her attention that made it impossible to pretend she wasn't asking you something. "You wouldn't," she said. "Your husband knew him, though. Grew up knowing him." She did not say more. I did not ask more. But that evening, alone in the kitchen with the lamplight burning, and the black glass of the uncovered windows all around me, I thought about the gray truck, and I thought about the word new, and I felt the first cold edge of something I had not yet named. Clara was quiet for a long time after I told her about Ruth. Then she said, "He was watching the house." "Yes," I said, though I didn't understand that fully for another 2 years. What I came to learn, slowly, in pieces, through Ruth's careful disclosures, and one conversation I was not meant to overhear, was this. Eli and Daniel Graber had grown up together. They had been close, in the way that young men in tight communities can be close, sharing work and worship, and the particular loyalty that forms between people who have no one outside the community to turn to. Something had broken between them before I arrived. I never learned the full cause. What I learned was that Daniel had left the district under circumstances that were considered a disgrace by the families involved, and that he had not gone quietly. He had made claims before he left, about property, about promises, about a piece of land on the county line that Eli's father had acquired in a transaction Daniel called dishonest. Daniel Graber had never accepted that it was over. The truck on the road was his. He had been driving past that property for years before I married into it. The family knew this. Eli's father knew this. The bishop of our district knew this. And the arrangement they had settled on, the solution that had been accepted quietly and never spoken of in plain terms, was to leave the windows bare. I want to explain this carefully, because the first time I understood it, I felt something I can only describe as the floor tilting. Not rage, not grief, a kind of structural vertigo. If the windows were curtained, Daniel Graber could stop his truck and watch the house, and not know what was happening inside it. A drawn curtain is a closed door. A drawn curtain can hide evidence of absence, of visitors, of documents being signed or meetings being held. But more than that, a drawn curtain is something that can be opened from the inside. A closed curtain can become a signal. Eli's father had been in a legal dispute with Daniel Graber that had moved, slowly and badly, through county courts for several years. A dispute over land records, over a handshake agreement that had no paper behind it. In that community, in those years, such things moved through unofficial channels as much as legal ones. What the families feared was not Daniel breaking into the house or confronting Eli in the yard. What they feared was collusion. What they feared was that I, the young wife who knew nothing, might one day move a curtain at a window as a man drove past, and that he might take that as a sign, and that there were people in our community who would interpret that the same way. I was the variable in their arrangement. My behavior at the windows was evidence, one way or the other, and no one had told me what I was providing evidence of. My husband had married me into a surveillance system and handed me a role in it without my knowledge or consent. The curtains were never about modesty. They were never about faith. They were about making sure I could not, even accidentally, communicate with a man who threatened his family's interests, and about making sure that anyone watching from the road could see, at any hour, that I was exactly where Eli expected me to be. I told Clara that part slowly. She said, "He was keeping you visible." Yes, not to protect you, to document you. I had never used that word before. It was the right word. There was a period in my 5th and 6th year of that marriage where I tried to believe there was a softer interpretation, that Eli had genuinely thought it was a manageable thing, a temporary legal situation that would resolve, and after which the curtains could come down, that his silence on the subject came from embarrassment rather than calculation. I tried to find the version of events where he was simply a man who had inherited a problem and handled it clumsily. But Ruth Yoder died in my 7th year, and in the weeks after her funeral, when I was helping clear her small house, her daughter handed me a sealed envelope with my name on the outside. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Ruth's handwriting. It said, "Ask Eli what he told the bishop the year before your wedding. Ask him what he promised about the girl he was bringing in from the other district. He knew what he was doing, Sarah. I am sorry I waited so long to say it plainly." I folded that paper and placed it beneath my apron, and finished helping with Ruth's kitchen. And that evening I made supper, and I waited until Clara was in bed. She was 4 years old by then. And I set the paper on the table between Eli and myself. He looked at it. He did not touch it. "She was an old woman," he said. "She was the only honest person in this township," I said. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The situation with Graeber is almost finished. The courts ruled last spring. That is not what I am asking about." He looked at the paper again. Then he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger, not dismissal, but something closer to the look of a man who has been carrying a thing in a bag he believed was sealed and has just discovered it was open the whole time. "I needed a wife who would stay inside," he said. I sat with those words for a long moment. The lamp was burning. The windows were bare and black behind him. "You needed a woman you could position," I said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I did not leave that week. I want to be honest about that. I had a 4-year-old daughter and no money of my own, and a community that would have understood my leaving only as a failure of faith and character. These are not excuses for the 2 more years I stayed. They are the actual weight I was standing under, and I think the older I get, the less willing I am to pretend that weight was imaginary. What I did, in the months after Ruth's letter, was begin to understand the architecture of what had been built around me. I stopped rationalizing the individual rules and started reading them as a system. The bare windows, the unspoken instructions about the road, the way Eli had always known, within a few minutes, where I was in the house. The fact that when I had once mentioned, in our 3rd year, that I'd seen a strange man near the barn, he had known immediately which direction the man had come from and which road he'd likely taken. Information he had not explained, and that I had not thought to question. He had been managing my presence in that house, the way you manage a lamp in a window. On, off, visible, not visible, traceable, documented. I was 22 years old when I walked into that arrangement. I was 27 before I fully saw it. I left in the late spring of my 9th year of marriage, in the practical, undramatic way that women in those circumstances sometimes manage to leave, through a series of small preparations that looked like nothing individually, and only became a departure when all of them were assembled at once. Clara came with me. She was 6. She remembers very little of the farmhouse now, and I have never decided whether that is loss or mercy. The legal matter with Daniel Graeber was, in fact, nearly finished by the time I left. The county courts had ruled largely against the Graeber family's claim the previous year. The gray truck stopped appearing on the road sometime during my 8th year. By then, the reason for the bare windows had expired. Eli never took them down anyway. I have thought about that more times than I can count. When the reason was gone, the habit remained, which tells me that the control was not only about Daniel Graeber. Daniel Graeber was the original reason, but the system had become the point. The visibility, the ability to know, at any moment, where his wife was, and whether she was contained. I have not spoken to Eli in many years. I know he still lives on that property. I know from people who knew people that he remarried within the community, a widow with older children, and that he is considered a steady and decent man by those who observe him on Sundays. I do not say that with bitterness. I say it because it is the most honest description of how these things work. A man can be decent in all the ways a community measures decency, and still have done what he did. Clara came to see me the week after I told her all of this. She sat across from me at the table with her coffee, and she was quiet in the way she gets when she is thinking something through, rather than reacting to it. She is careful like that. I have always been glad of it. She asked me how I felt now, telling it. I said I felt lighter in the specific way you feel when you have been carrying something in a coat pocket for so long that you forgot it was there, and then you reach in one day and take it out and hold it in the light and realize it was never as heavy as the habit of carrying it. She looked at the kitchen window, the one with the yellow paint on the sill, the one with nothing covering it at all. She said, "I always thought you liked the light." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "I do now," I said. "I like it because I chose it. That is a difference worth 31 years of knowing." She squeezed my hand once and didn't let go, and outside the uncovered window the afternoon was doing what afternoons do in spring, spending itself slowly, without asking permission, without anyone's oversight, golden and indifferent, and entirely free.